Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is a detailed build guide on the Lancool 207. In this guide, I'm going to show you how to set it up with the standard included fans, along with a HxWxD cooler, and everything that you need to know for getting it working nicely. This is going to include a breakdown of the case and the aspects of it. I'm going to do a review separately on the case if you're curious to see how it performs in a couple of different setups. Now, this is a fairly easy case to build in, thanks to the pre-installed fans and some interesting logic, with a couple of caveats that I'll get to in a minute. And I'm going to leave timestamps down below so you can jump to relevant points in the video. One thing of note is there is an extension lead for your power supply cable at the rear here, because the PSU actually sits at the front of the case, which is fairly unusual, but more on that in a little while. The door, as you can see on the side panel, tugs off, with a couple of notches at the bottom for supporting it. So you just pull it towards you and then lift it up. The top panel also removes by just being tugged off towards the top. And you'll see that there is no internal mesh there, so there's no extra dust mesh coverings. The bottom panel down here can also be removed, and then you can access the extension cable for the power supply unit. The rear door just needs to be tugged backwards and lifted up in the same way as the front panel. And you'll notice there's a little venting down the bottom there for airflow towards the SSDs and for your power supply unit. The front panel can be removed really easily to access those fans and clean them, or remove them if you want to swap them out. And again, there's no integrated dust shielding here. It's just that front panel, so you'll need to take that off and clean it eventually. These front fans are very nice though, 140mm fans with an infinity mirror in the middle. They are RGB fans that are already daisy chained together, so just require two cables to connect to your motherboard, and I'll show you where to plug those in later on with some fairly straightforward connections. And then you've got two fans at the bottom of the case down here set to intake to blow air onto your graphics card, and those two only have one cable that you need to worry about, which is a very nice and straightforward setup here. You'll see that the power supply unit goes on the right-hand side, and there's also an included Anti Sag Bracket for your graphics card. So there's some very nice highlights to this case, and some interesting design changes from other Lian Li cases, and indeed other cases out there. There's not much in the way of cable management on the right-hand side of the rear here. All the channeling is on the left, but there is indeed a lot of channeling there, and as you'll see, plenty of space for managing the cables. Now you can see I've got the case stripped down with all the panels off. In fairness, you don't need to take the front one off. I just wanted to show you what that looks like. But I'd recommend stripping off all the others just so that you can easily access things during the build process. A quick look at that anti-sag bracket. You'll see that it's down there at the front, and you can actually reposition it into three different places depending on the length of your graphics card. It has a little foam on the bottom of it to push gently onto the bottom of your GPU, and you can secure it in the different places and then adjust the height of it depending on the size of your GPU. I'll show you how to set it up later on. At the rear, you'll see the cables are already running through those various different channels here, and I actually am a big fan of those channels, and I'll show you the cabling for those in a second. Down the bottom is two trays that you can remove, one with the accessories parts in it, and we'll get to that installation as well. And then you have the power supply extension lead, which runs from the rear to where your power supply is going to install. I'd recommend just getting these things out of the way for now. Bundled together are the front panel connections, and I'll show you where these plug in later on, but they're held together in the Velcro ties here, which as you can see are three-part. So you can pull the top part off, and then there's an inner part. So you actually have a choice in where to mount your cables. There's a nice big gap underneath those as well, so you can easily run thicker cables through there and then smaller cables on the top bits. Now the accessories tray is strapped to the SSD tray as standard, so you'll need to take that off. And then inside there you'll find lots of different screws and parts. A lot of them are actually extra accessories that you won't necessarily need depending on how you're doing the build. But you can see what's included in the accessories kit in the manual, and that includes everything from long fan screws for the front fans, for example, and the bottom fans, and a additional set of other things. You have a few Velcro ties, but not very many, but that's okay because you mostly won't be using them if you follow my build. You don't really need to. You also have these little plastic sections for this accessories box, So you can section it off nicely, and then you can put the various screws in there. Now, I really like this. Lian Li's been doing this for a while now, but essentially it allows you to just manage your screws and make sure they're all in the right place and all neatly bundled together. One note though is that I did find that one of the bags contains several different screws. So most of them contain the same screws in one bag, but there's this one bag that had motherboard standoffs in it and SSD screws and power supply screws all bundled into one bag. So I found that I had to separate those out. So I would recommend referring to the manual in order to work out which one's which, and then just put them in their own section so you can keep them neat and together for when you need them. It's fairly straightforward, but again, a lot of these are extra. You might not need them. Now for the SSD mounting, the two trays, you can either put hard disk drives or SSDs on there. If you're using SSDs, you use these smaller screws, which you can see have a thinner bottom. If you look at the hard disk drive ones, you'll find them a bit fatter. You need these anti-vibration mounts to push into the 4 points where the screws will go through. So they push in with a little bit going through the hole, and then we're going to screw the drive in a second. So 4 of those in there, basically to help you secure the drive down. Now, obviously SSD doesn't have any moving parts, but it does just mean that it's secured nicely with these rubber washers in there. You put the little screws through the underneath of those into the holes and then screw them in to secure them. Now, this same logic would apply for a hard disk drive if you're using that instead, but obviously you'd use the outer screw holes instead, and those anti-vibration mounts would actually make a bigger difference there, because the drive on a hard disk drive obviously has a platter which spins, which makes some noise. Here you want to make sure that your cables are facing towards the front, so the ports that are going to be plugged into, you need to make sure that's towards the thumb screw that secures it back into the case. So if you've got 2 drives, repeat this process, and you can see here a closer look of how those anti-vibration mounts go in. Small part pushes into the top, and then the screw holes line up, and then you just secure it. The installation of this is fairly straightforward, but as you can see, you are limited to either 2 SSDs or 2 hard disk drives, or 1 of each, depending on what storage you're using. Not necessarily a problem. You might well be using NVMe SSDs as well, as I will be. But the process for this is fairly straightforward. Just remember that the SSD screws and the hard disk drive screws are a different thickness at the bottom. So if you're following this process for hard disk drives, you'll need the other screws. So refer to the case manual to see what those look like. The drives then slip back into the case. You can see there's a couple of notches that need to line up with the holes in the case. Slide that in and then screw them down with the thumb screws, and you can secure both of those quite easily. And then we'll plug in the power cables and data cables for those later on. You need to run the data cables to your motherboard to make sure the data is transferred nicely. And then we go on to the power supply unit. I want to show you something of interest here. So I'm trying to use the Corsair RM Shift power supply unit in this case, just to demonstrate something. Normally with the design of the RM Shift, the power supply sits so that the cables face backwards to the rear of the case, so you can easily manage the cables. But here, obviously, because of the way the power supply actually sits towards the front and facing at a different angle, you can't actually put it in because the power cables are blocked by the design of the case here, so you can't use that, just as a warning. Instead, I'm going to use the Lian Li Edge power supply unit. This is obviously a Lian Li product and a very nice one. I've done a separate setup and wiring guide on this that I'll link to in the description, because as you will see, it also has a USB hub built into it, which might well be useful depending on what you're doing with your build. But more importantly, it also has easy access ports, and I'm going to show you how to plug in the cables you need for your build if you're following along. First of all, we're going to start with the motherboard power. So this is a 24-pin power cable and 2 EPS power cables for the CPU power. And this is a large 24-pin power connector. On one end, it's split into 2 parts, and that's the part that plugs into the power supply unit, and then the other end plugs into the motherboard. A quick note again, if you need to, you can skip forward in the video if you already know all this, using the timestamps down below to jump to other points. But these are the 8-pin CPU power connectors, which are clearly marked CPU on one end that plugs into the motherboard and PSU on the other end that plugs into the power supply unit. You'll need both of these sets of cables for most modern motherboards if you want to make the most of them, so I'd recommend plugging them in. I'm going to show you how to do that outside the case now, so it's really easy to see. where those plug in, but obviously you'd only plug in the power supply end for now, and then we'll get to the motherboard connections later on. But you're looking for the motherboard 18 plus 10P connections here for the 24-pin power connector first of all. So we need to untie this and then plug it into that port. And this cable obviously is the main power source for your motherboard. So you need to make sure it's fully seated at both ends, plugged all the way into the power supply and all the way into the motherboard. If it isn't, then your machine might not power on. So it's important to note that. But we're pushing that cable in with a little plastic clip. You can only push it in one way on both ends. There's a little clip that pushes into a hole or notches over a port on the motherboard, for example. So you need to make sure it's pushed all the way in and clicks into place at both ends. The 24-pin power cable plugs in on the right-hand side of the motherboard. It's always in the same place. Top right-hand side there, pushes in there until it's fully seated, and you should hear a click, and then you won't be able to get it back out again without first of all lifting the latch on the right-hand side. And then obviously we have these cable combs, which you can run backwards along the power cables to neaten things up once it's in your build and to make things nice and tidy. These are really handy, but take care with them because you can accidentally make them come apart if you're not gentle, which is obviously be a pain, but you can see that you can run them to various points in there to really neaten those cables up, which can be useful later once we've got it installed in the case. So that's one of the power connectors, and you should make sure that is fully plugged in, as I've said. Next up is the 8-pin CPU power connectors, also known as the EPS cables. They have a CPU marking on one end, which is where it plugs into the motherboard, and then PSU on the other. These are slightly different cables. You'll notice that one, for example, has CPU written on it twice, and it can be split apart. This can be useful if you've got a different motherboard to the one I'm using, because you might have one 8-pin CPU power connector and one 4-pin on the motherboard that needs powering, so you can easily split that cable apart and then plug it in. You'll see that it does slide together, so there's a slight notch on it which slides it in. Most motherboards, in my experience, have two 8-pins, but there is some variety in it, so it's worth watching out when you go about your build which one you have in your system. But I would recommend using both of these. We plug the PSU end into the ports marked CPU and PCIe. Find a relevant slot there. I'd recommend on the far right hand side near the 12-volt high power connector rather than the left, as I'm showing you here. And I'll talk about why in a little while, but you need to make sure you've got plenty of length to be able to reach these ports in the case. But they plug in on the top left-hand corner of the motherboard. And again, you can only plug them in one way because you'll see that there is a little bracket which needs to clip over the very edge of the port. And they're also pinned out in a certain way, so they have a shape to them, which is either square or rounded on those various different pins when you look closely. So make sure you plug both of these in, especially if you have a motherboard which is capable of overclocking, or if you want to push your system. But I'd recommend plugging them in anyway. You have the cables, you have the ports, make sure it's all plugged in to make the most of your system, and then you'll end up with these connections to the motherboard eventually once we get there. Next up is the SATA cable, which is used for the hard disk drives, SSDs, your all-in-one cooler, and maybe other things too, like a fan controller, for example. Plugs into the SATA ports on the power supply end, and then you'll see it just connects up to the drives with the other end, which is daisy chainable, so you can connect multiple things to it. Now, it has an L-shaped connector to it with a slight notch on there, so you need to make sure you're watching out for that because you can only plug these cables in one way around. But you can plug multiple things into one cable. In this instance, a hard disk drive and an SSD, but two SSDs, and in the end I use two SSDs and the liquid cooler as well. Now, you might find if you're using other setups that we want to use the PCIe power cables for something else. So, for example, if you're using Lian Li's TL LCD fans, you might need one of these PCIe power connectors. This is generally for graphics cards, but the TL series controller requires this power as well. The end that plugs into the power supply is put into the CPU and PCIe power ports, and then the PCIe end plugs into this adapter for power connections on the TL controller. Now, I'm not actually using it in this build, but I know a lot of people like the TL fans. I've done a separate guide on how to set those up, and that's the essential power connector that you would need for that if you are planning on putting those fans into your build. Now we're on to graphics cards. This is a 3090, and you can see we've got 4 PCIe power cables included as standard. So if you're using one with TL, you still have 3 spare cables, which you can see here. These are your traditional 8-pin PCIe power connectors, which are split into a 6 and 2 power connector, which needs to be pushed together at the graphics card end. The PSU end is a solid connector, which obviously plugs into the PCIe ports I've just shown you. Now, these cables can be a little bit fiddly, and you need to take care with the PCIe end that you make sure you push those together properly when inserting into your GPU, because if the part that has 2 connectors on it comes loose, the GPU won't get full power and you might find your performance isn't as good as it should be. So find a spare port marked CPU and PCIe on the power supply unit, and then plug those cables in there. Obviously, you have to work out how many cables you're going to need. In this case, the 3090 has 2 power connectors on it, but if you have 3, then you'll need 3 cables naturally. And then the other end, you just need to make sure you push it together and insert it. Now, obviously, I'm showing you this outside the build just so it's really easy and clear to see, but we'll actually plug these cables in later on if you're going to be installing your GPU and setting it up like this. You want to make sure those cables are pinched together nicely and pushed firmly into the port until they click into place. But you need to make sure both parts of both cables are fully inserted, otherwise you just won't get the performance you should do. And that's that. But as you can see, there's enough cables to plug in more power-hungry GPUs if required. Now, we're using a 4070 Ti here as an alternative. These come with these adapters as standard, the 12-volt high power connector, which plugs into the graphics card on one end and then has several power connectors on the other, either 2, 3, or 4 power connectors, depending on your 40 series graphics card. And then you have to use the 8-pin PCIe power connectors that I've just shown you to plug in the cables to that port. Now, this is a FAF, and that adapter is ugly and difficult to manage. And as you'll have seen if you're paying attention at the beginning of the video, I actually don't end up using it. And that's the good thing about this power supply, is that you don't have to. If you want to, you can. You can obviously use all 4 power cables to plug into this adapter, or a 3-port one, depending on what you have included with your GPU. But instead, you want to get rid of all this cabling mess, although you will note there are cable combs on each of the cables. You can instead adapt the 12-volt power cable instead. And that's this cable here, which is marked 600 watts on both ends and has these little blue ports on there. You'll notice that it's the same at both ends and can be plugged in to the power supply and the graphics card, abandoning that adapter and the standard PCIe power cables to neaten up your build and to make life a lot easier. You do need to make sure you fully seat this in, just as you would for the other connector, but you can see the 12-volt high power connector in the far right corner of the power supply ports here. So you plug in one end to that, make sure you push it all the way in so you can't see the blue anymore. You can see that sticking out ever so slightly still, so you need to make sure that's pushed all the way in, and then do the same on the graphics card end. And then that obviously makes life a lot neater and a lot tidier. Now, with the installation of a power supply, traditionally you'd put it fan down towards the bottom of the case, and that will then allow for cooling, because that fan will be pulling cold air from below to cool the power supply unit. And then in this build, obviously, we'd then screw it in on the front hand side here with 4 screws. You want the hexagonal screws to secure that into place. This case, though, however, Lian Li recommends doing it the other way up if you're using the Edge power supply. Now, I haven't really worked out why that's the case. It can still pull air from above because there's some venting, as you'll see. But I think that the reason for this is to make it easier to access the cable ports, but also better cable management options and a little bit more length. However, there's still an issue that I'll show you in a minute. But for now, we're going to set up the motherboard and the CPU and RAM and NVMe SSDs and more. Again, you can skip forward if you know all this, but we're going to be using a Ryzen 7 CPU in this build, along with a Strix motherboard. Note the little gold arrow in the corner there, which will give you a hint in which way round to install the CPU. So we lift the lever on the flap there, lift that little cover off the top, and then we're going to gently put the CPU in place. You can see there's notches at the top and bottom that you need to line up in the port so you don't get it the wrong way around. Don't drop it in, carefully seat it into place, making note of that gold arrow in the top left corner and where that puts in. Put the latch back down and then adjust that lever down until the plastic clip pops off, and then you should have that set up. For the RAM, we want the 2 ports, the second one and the 4th one, so that's A2 and B2. We're going to put our DDR5 RAM into those ports and gently push it in place until it clips into place. You can only put this RAM in one way round, but you'll notice the barcode is on the left-hand side facing towards us from that angle. So that's how you know which way round it is with this Corsair Vengeance RAM. Push it until it clicks into place and is latched in. Then for the NVMe SSD, we're going to use the top port here, removing this heat shielding first of all, and making sure all the stickers are removed from the thermal pads, and then gently put the Samsung drive into place and use the little Q latch to secure it. Then make sure there's no stickers on the top thermal pad and put that heatsink back on. You'll notice that I left the sticker on the NVMe on, and that's because my testing shows you actually get better performance with those stickers in place, so don't remove them. That's the motherboard mostly prepped, so now I'm going to show you a setup for the HxWxD LCD 360R that we're using in this build. I've done a separate detailed guide on this, which also shows you how to swap the fans if you want to, so I'll link to that in the description if you want to jump over there. This is an interesting cooler because the tubes and the wiring all run along the edge here, which means you can mostly hide it away and neaten things up. The fan wiring will run through there as well, so it's very tidy. You can see that cable comes out of there, and then you have a bunch of cables to run to the rear and to plug into things. But there's only 3 cables: power, USB, and the CPU fan header. So it's pretty straightforward in terms of the setup. And in this build, I'm going to show you how to use this as an exhaust radiator at the top of the case. Because this is an AM5 motherboard, we first of all need to remove the standard bracketing at the top and bottom, above and below the CPU socket. So take that out and keep hold of the standard screws that are included there, and then the Hydroshift comes with its own bracketing to make your life a little bit easier. So we remove that, and trust me, this is much easier to install than using that standard AM5 bracketing. But we pop this new bracketing in and then use the screws that come with the original bracketing to re-secure it in the same standoffs above and below the motherboard. Notice the angle of how the new bracketing is sitting, sort of facing upwards and downwards depending on the top and bottom views that you're seeing here. But that's secured in there, and then the cooler is going to sit on top of that and nicely cool the CPU. And then we'll just have some wiring to deal with. It's a really straightforward setup if you're using AM5. So that's the motherboard prep done, including that bracketing. So now we're going to seat the motherboard into the case using the standard pre-installed standoffs in there. You'll notice it was a little bit fiddly to line up the I/O with the rear, so that's one thing of note. But we then have 9 screws that need to be put in. So these are these little motherboard screws, which have a little bump on the top of them. But again, reference the case manual if you're not sure what screws to use. But there's 3 screw holes across the top, middle and bottom on each of those rows. So 9 screws total that you need to screw in order to secure the motherboard. Now we're going to go back to the power supply wiring, and I'll show you the mounting for the cooler in a second. But basically what we're going to run is the 2 8-pin CPU power cables up to the top here. Now this is the one thing you're going to have a problem with, or at least I did. Maybe you won't, but you can see what we need to do is to run the cables through the channeling on the left hand side there, and then try and stretch them out to the 8-pin power connectors on the motherboard. Now I actually found the cables very short and quite tricky to get to, so watch for that in a second. And then we secure the power supply on the other end with the 4 hexagonal screws into the 4 corners. So you can see here I'm struggling to plug in the 2 8-pin CPU power cables. there is not much length in these cables with the power supply at the front of the case as it is. So I found this really fiddly to do. Hopefully you don't have the same problems, but with this edge power supply mounted as it is, I found that I couldn't get the cables to run across properly. You'll see they're stretching across the back of the motherboard. It doesn't look great. Then at the front of the case, you need to make sure that you plug in that power cable from the rear, so the extension cable plugs in to the power supply. Note, obviously, you'll need to turn the power switch on in order for this to work when it's fully set up, but don't do that yet. We want to make sure we plugged in everything else first of all. And then we need to run the 24-pin power cable for the motherboard through this rubber grommeted area here. Now, you can see that I've taken the Velcro ties off so I can put that all the way underneath, because there's a large gap for this cable, which makes these ties ideal for securing it down and neatening things up with it, because there's a lot of cabling there. And if you've got a different power supply with thicker cables, this will be very useful for keeping those cables in place and tidy. You need to make sure your cables are tidy at the rear, because otherwise you'll have trouble putting the rear door back on. Again, that 24-pin power cable plugs in on the right-hand side here, clicks into place, make sure it does click in firmly and that it's secured properly. And then you can use the cable combs to adjust and neaten the cable up if you want to. Now, you could alternatively run your power cable where that gap is, you can see, instead of using the rubber grommet, but I thought it'd be nice to use that rubber area. It's going to be a personal preference. Then I'm running the USB-A and USB-C connectors through. So that's for the top panel connections. We need to run those through the similar gap towards the right-hand side here. USB-C and USB-A plugs in near the 24-pin power connector. It's generally the same on most motherboards, but you can only plug these cables in one way. The USB-A one has a plastic notch on it. The USB-C will only click into place one way around. So if you're struggling with either of them, just try turning them round before you push them into the ports. And then that's the motherboard set up nicely at the front. You can see it's looking pretty neat so far. Then we have a load of other cables to plug in. The F panel connector, which is obviously for your power switch on top. Feed that through and it plugs in on the right hand side here on the motherboard. So the bottom right, you're looking for something like F panel and the power reset switch set up on that side there. You can find you'll only be able to plug it in one way because it's missing one pin, so you should be able to line that up quite nicely and plug it in. And then we have HD audio, which runs on the other side of the motherboard on the far left. On this motherboard it's marked AAFP, but sometimes it's HD audio. Again, the connector is missing a pin, so it's pretty easy to plug that cable in. Then you've got a 5V RGB cable and a chassis fan cable for the front fans. So these plug into the chassis fan header or system fan header on your motherboard and the 5V RGB header on your motherboard as well. So you plug the 3-pin RGB connector into this port here. You can see marked 5 volts. And then the 4-pin fan power cable plugs into the chassis fan header or system fan header. Note, for the intake fans on the bottom of the case, you'll need that same connector. So you'll actually have to plug 2 of those cables in. So make sure all those cables are plugged in at the bottom, including the chassis fan or system fan headers, so that all the fans get power. And that's that set up. And then we're going to run the SATA cable through. So this is for the SSD power. I found that tidying it up towards the top would be useful. So I actually ran it up and then back down again. And the reason for this is obviously you don't want these cables to get into the way of the bottom fans blocking the airflow down there. But you plug the power connectors into the SSDs there. And then don't forget to run the data cables from those SSDs to your motherboard as well. And then secure those cables on the left hand side there, so they're neat and out of the way. We're trying to neaten things up as much as possible back here. Next up, we have the radiator and the pump for the Lian Li cooler. And what I found is best to do is just to put the rad in first of all, and then seat the pump down, because what we want to do is be able to plug the cables in nicely and secure everything. So you need to be able to run those cables through to the rear, but also plug cables into the motherboard. So securing the radiator immediately might make that tricky. So I'm using Noctua's thermal paste guard for this setup as well, which I've done a video on separately. But basically this is a bit of plastic that covers the AM5 CPU around the edges so that when you're applying the thermal paste, it doesn't matter if you go right to the edge because any overspill will be caught on that plastic and won't go onto the CPU itself. This isn't a major problem if you don't want to use this. This is an additional purchase, but it does make things a lot neater. You leave that on and then you just put your block down over the top, remembering to remove that sticky plastic over there first of all. Then we just put it down over the top of the standoffs, which we put in place earlier on, and then use a screwdriver to secure corner to corner, one corner to the opposite corner, go through all 4 of those, securing and tightening until they won't tighten up anymore. Don't be overly aggressive with it, but you do want to screw them until they stop and can't be tightened anymore, and then that will make sure that it's nicely secured and gives you the good cooling that you need. Then we have that single cable that runs from the pump head, which is meant to plug into either the AIO header or the CPU fan header. I find that plugging in CPU fan means that you won't get any complaints from your BIOS when you try and load your system up, so it's probably preferable. And then we have the other cables to run to the rear, which includes SATA power and USB, and I'll show you those in a second. And then we need to secure the radiator to the top of the case. You'll find lots of little screws included with this cooler, which you just screw through the top here, securing the radiator. And basically this is set up to exhaust air through the radiator and out the top of the case. Obviously we've got 2 large intake fans on the case and 2 intake fans on the bottom as well, and then this is exhausting out the back. But you do need to make sure you run this cable from the pump through to the rear. It has a USB connection on it and SATA power. So again, the SATA power connection, same as the SSD power connector, plugs in there, and that will make sure the pump gets power and also the screen as well. So it's very important you plug that in. And then the USB connection runs to the bottom middle of the motherboard. It's important to make sure you do this, otherwise you won't be able to power and control that thing from L-Connect. So you will find there's 3 USB connections at the bottom of the motherboard, but you only need 1 of those cables to plug in at the middle there. And so we can plug that in, and that will make sure that the display works properly later on. Then we're doing a test boot. So plug your actual power cable into the extension cable, which then plugs into the power supply unit, flip the switch, and then power the system on. Everything's all plugged in nicely. So now I can see that the fans are working. The bottom fans are spinning, the front ones are lighting up, the display is lighting up, the radiator fans are lighting up, so everything's working nicely. So powered it off again, remove the power cable, and now I'm removing the bracketing from the rear. So I need to remove 2 of those PCIe brackets from the rear of the case, and then I can put the graphics card in. Don't forget to move the Anti Sag Bracket before you do, because that might get in the way. So I pushed mine down a bit, and then push the GPU into the top PCIe X16 slot to make sure you get the maximum speed, and then resecure the thumb screws which you took out of the PCIe brackets to make sure it's secured nicely at the rear of the case and fully seated in there. Then as a reminder, we're using the 600 watt 12 volt high power cable plugged into the power supply unit and then run through the front. What you'll find here is a very nice setup where you can run it above the SSDs, and then there's a nice hole just below the graphics card where you can run this cable up and through so that you can actually keep it nice and neat. So you can see that it's just a port here which you can run it up and through there rather than having to work it from some other weird direction in the case. And then it will just plug in nicely into your GPU. Make sure you fully see that all the way in, and then neaten the cable up nicely and use the cable combs just to make it look nice and clean. And that's mostly set up now, as you can see, and I'm pretty happy with how this build's come out and how neat it looks. But do take note to be careful with the cables at the bottom of the case, like this graphics card cable, for example, because obviously we've got those 2 intake fans down the bottom there. We don't want to interfere with. You don't want cables touching those. So put the power back on and turn it all on again just to make sure everything's got power as it should do. I can see the GPU fans are spinning and other things are spinning. And now I just want to do a few more minor adjustments, one of which is to make sure the anti-sag bracket is in the right place. So lift it up and then screw it in tighter at the rear with that thumb screw, which is now hidden behind your cables a little bit. And that will secure the GPU to make sure it's not sagging over time. You can see there's plenty of space still left there for a bigger graphics card as well if you wanted to. And this is the final result. Now, I haven't opted for a rear fan here. I actually wanted to test out and see what the performance would be like with the standard fans. So I'm going to do a full review on that in the near future. But as you can see, that was a really straightforward build and very easy to do for a number of very nice highlights and straightforward setup options here. Obviously resecuring everything now, putting that bottom bracket back into place. The front mesh panel just clips into place there nicely. The top one just pops back on as well. Everything is securing nicely there. The one problem that I had was with the rear door. These 8-pin CPU power cables were stopping me from closing that initially. So you'll have to make sure they're flattened out before you can get those in. And you'll probably want to do the plastic peel when the glass is off the case. But I'm a renegade and a little bit crazy, so I like to do it when it's on there just so you can see. And then we have the final build here. Ever so slightly tinted glass makes for a bit of a stealth build. I'm actually going to do this build again with Noctua's Chromax black fans to see if I can make it even stealthier. But the case itself is very nice and easy to set up and looks really nice, especially with those infinity mirror fans on the front. So it is a very nice build here, and I'll leave all the specs of what I've done in the description down below so you can find out what I've included in the build. But now for a few other things. And then on to setting up Windows. So on a separate PC, search for the Windows Media Creation tool. And we're going to download the latest update for Windows 11 and install that. So there's a Windows Media Creation tool here, which you'll need a USB drive for. I've shown how to do this on your phone if you don't have a spare PC. I'll link to that video. And then you can just basically go through the process, use this creation tool to install it on a drive that is external, and then you'll be able to plug it into your new PC that you're building and install Windows. So you have to wait a little bit of time for this to happen. But once it's complete, you want to take the drive that you've installed it onto, plug it into the back of your motherboard, and then turn the PC on. You should find that it then automatically recognizes there's a Windows creation drive plugged in. And then when it starts through the boot process, it should take you into the tool for installing Windows. You'll then need to follow the on-screen prompts to install the Windows relevant to your location. I'm obviously going for United Kingdom because that's time and format, and also the keyboard method, but you might want to choose other ones. Apologies for some of the focus on some of these clips, it went a bit wrong, but basically you want to go through the steps here. If you have a product key, enter it. If you don't, just click I don't have one. You can do that later on. Then Windows 11 Home, and then the installation for that, and just keep clicking through. We want to do custom install, so install Windows only. Click on that and then select the drive that we're using. Click new to create the relevant partition on that and set it up, and then just keep clicking next, go through and start installing Windows. Now, we'll take some time to do this, and obviously we also need to make sure we get the updates once we get into there. But you go through, click that, and then wait, be patient. And then what you will find is eventually, once it gets to the part where it's about to finish, you'll need to unplug the USB drive that you plugged in for when it reboots. Otherwise, it will try and use this again. So just once you get to the end of the process here, when it says it's about to restart, just keep an eye on it. Because when it goes through that restart process, as you can see, the bar's filling up here, take that drive out and then allow it to reboot, and it should just reboot into the final stages of the Windows installation without the need for that drive. Once you're in Windows and that's all set up nicely, the next thing you want to do is head over to Lian Li's website and grab L-Connect 3. So Google L-Connect 3 and head over to the Lian Li site here and download that. You'll need this in order to control the display and the RGB lighting on the fans. So you want to make sure you've got that as well as the other things, and make sure to read the notice there as well. But what you want to do is go to download that, install it, and then you can go to the Hydroshift LCD, and then you can go in there and you can adjust the display in various different ways. You can also choose the fan and pump profile. So you'll see under that section, you can set the speed, high speed, quiet, full speed. You can choose from various different options there, and you can adjust the speed of the fans on the system. And then under the display section, you can choose from various different setups in there. There's lots of different options and effects that you can apply directly. And a lot of these will also include the various different temperature readouts and performance metrics, which can also be very handy. You can see that you also have fan pump profile and things there, so you can choose what speed your fans are running at and what speed the pump's running at. You can go through custom various other things, and you can really make the system work properly. Also, make sure you go into the update section regularly and check for firmware updates on your system, because this can be very handy, both for the software and for the firmware updates there. And then enjoy your new PC. This has been the Provoked Prawn. If you found this useful, subscribe for more. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.